Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hi, thank you very much for joining the Sociology Show podcast. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. My name is Jonas Hart. I'm an adjunct assistant professor here in Harrisonburg, Virginia at James Madison University. I also teach online and part-time for the Community College of Vermont system, and I do that virtually as well. I am a sociologist by training, but also I come to it from a background in religious studies. And so my area of interest and research in sociology is the sociology of religion. And here at James Madison, I teach every semester large sections of an intro to sociology and micro sociology course. We have two intro courses, micro and macro. I handle a great deal of the micro section. And then every spring I teach a sociology of religion course. That is an upper level course, a smaller course that digs deeper into the field, the subfield of religious sociology of religion, based on the idea that the students come in with a lot of, they're mostly majors, so they have a lot of sociological knowledge already. So I don't have to do a lot of the intro work. I can just dig into the religious side, the religion side of sociology. And I've been here at James Madison for 5 years now. My wife's a political scientist here, and I've been teaching online and in person for the Community College of Vermont for about 19 years. And I do intro to sociology and global social problems for them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonas. And I always ask people why that area, why religion, why is that particular area for yourself?
Well, as I mentioned, my background, I have a undergraduate degree and a master's degree in religious studies. They were subjects that I got interested in immediately upon starting my college career. I had some excellent professors and really an undergraduate advisor and professor who turned me on to the study of religion very early on. And that was mostly textual based. So New Testament, Hebrew Bible, Jesus and the Gospels, sort of traditional religious studies work. And as I got towards graduation, I ended up doing work more globally, Islam, South Asia. And then my senior year, I took a brilliant class with a great professor named Whitney Kelting. And she taught a class on religion and violence, or politics and religion, really, and looking at South Asia and the conflict really between politics, or the conflicts that involve politics and religion in South Asia. And my view sort of turned toward lived religion, or the role religion plays in everyday life for people. And then I moved on to my master's and focused on Islam and Muslim communities in North America in particular, so Canada and the US. And I wrote a thesis that dealt with big political things and the way the state interacts with religion, and religion with the state and people, which was much more sociology, as it turns out, than it was religious studies, unbeknownst to me, because I didn't know sociology particularly well. But the work I produced was really much more sociological than it was religious studies, so less concerned with faith and faith traditions or questions of faith, more about religious identity and the role that politics, the state, and what Weber calls life chances, how those all come together are really what interests me. And so I came down, so I'm from Vermont up north, which is the background you see there. And I came down to the University of Virginia and started a PhD program focusing again on the sociology of religion, and really interested in how the state and politics and identity play roles in liberal democracies. As I mentioned to you, Matthew, I explained a little bit about it. That fascinates me, right? Liberal meaning, lower L, liberal meaning free, democratic societies that offer the freedom of religion, the freedom from compulsion of religion. How does that And what does that mean for religious minorities? And there are many religious minorities. I just happen to be interested in how Muslim communities and Islam as a phenomenon function in liberal democracies that were historically Christian and white. And I think in the UK and around the world, we see how that plays out very differently. And so that's what I focused on.
Great, thank you very much for that. We'll come on to the state bit in a moment, but you mentioned the role of religion and identity. Can I ask what role religion plays for you? Do you have a faith, and how strong is it or not?
Very fair question, and I'm glad you asked. I was born and raised Catholic, and I've seen John Paul II twice in the flesh. I grew up going to church every Sunday, but like many Northeasterners, religion isn't a strong force in the world. The Northeast in the U.S. is fairly secularized relative to where I live now, let's say, or not even secularized. Yeah, I guess you could use secularization. That's a rabbit hole we can go down some other time, maybe. But I gave up my Catholicism for Lent some time ago, so it doesn't play a role insofar as I'm coming at my explorations of the religion in society from a position of faith, more that as an observer of the claims made by liberal democracies and the claims made by religious traditions, I am fascinated by that coming together. That is an interesting and real and important coming together in the world, irrespective of how I feel about it. And as I mentioned to you in our conversation, the study of religion does not need to come from a position of faith. But what you find, as I'm sure you found, many people who study religion in any of its manifestations do come from faith traditions. And in sociology, as you know, we have something called me-search, although it exists in other disciplines, where people are studying themselves and they're studying their own religious traditions. And in fact, in my own training, it was frequently assumed that because I'm studying religion, I myself must be religious, and I am not. I think religion is important. Religion matters, regardless of whether or not you believe it's true or if it's correct, or any critique you may have of it. It exists in the world. It shapes people's lives. It needs to be continued to be studied. But myself, I do not come from a place of saying my faith informs, or lack thereof, or whatever you want to say, informs how I approach what I do. I simply acknowledge the fact that people's faith drive their decision making in the world. We live in a world where those decisions impact all of us, and so we should be better aware of what that role that religion is playing for people.
That's interesting, because you mentioned I myself I went to a Roman Catholic school for primary school and secondary school, but was never particularly strong in my faith, and now would consider myself an atheist. But it's interesting you say that even though there has been that move away for a lot of people, it's still critical or important in people's lives, even in Western democracy. So why do you think that is? Why do you think it's still a critical part of society?
Great question, and one that I address in my class frequently, and one that I've been asked to respond to. And I have a simple answer, and then the complex answer, which is shorter, which is I don't know. The simple answer, and I don't mean it to sound glib or sarcastic, but there's something existential about human life on Earth, where we look up in the sky and see something that we can't explain, and we see stars, and we see distance and vastness, and we feel small. And I think there is. We don't like the idea of human nature in sociology, but I think there is something, I resist to say natural, in thinking about the world beyond ourselves. And I think religion functionally, and to get myself into trouble thinking about functionalist perspectives, religion in almost all cases answers at least three questions, which is where do we come from, what are we doing here, and where do we go? And people like that comfort. And one of the things that I mentioned in my class, that early sociologists, Weber, Durkheim, Marx, among others, were concerned about social problems. And as neutral or objective as we try to be in social science, those guys really were pointing out problems, which means you're no longer neutral. And those problems in the world of of being disconnected from other people, of being alienated from your labor, or being over-rationalized to the point of being miserable, they were pointing out in the turn of the century, those problems still exist. We are still miserable. We are still overworked. We are still disconnected from each other and from our labor, although, that Marxist perspective is particular. That stuff hasn't gone away. And so the global social problems class that I teach addresses those same issues that Marx, Weber, and Durkheim were asking about France, Germany, and the UK in 1850 to 1920. But we're looking at it in Brazil and China and developing parts of Africa, where this coming together of the modern world or the industrialized world and agrarian communities are generating significant social problems. That suffering, that concern of life, that what the hell's going on, those questions still exist. And religion of all stripes still provide answers for people that comfort, that support, that generate good things, right? So it's not just the opiate of the masses, you're suffering and so have this thing. It's generative of compassion and taking care of each other and community, which we are social creatures, and religion brings us together. And so it's one of the many things it does. So to sum that up, religion is still doing the things that religion has always done for people that people seem to want and need. Now, again, that's overly functional, and I apologize to that I may offend the non-functionalists in the world, but that's an easy way to get at the importance of religion. You can go on from there, but really it's still providing the things that humans seem to need and want in order to face what is the jungle of the world.
Mm. See, I'm going to come at it from a very atheist point of view, okay? Because that makes sense to me, to someone that has faith. If you're searching for the questions, who are we, why are we here, yes, where do we go, that might work. But let's say for myself, saying that I come from God and I will go to heaven or hell, doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it true. For myself. So is it? There must be a gap between those that accept those are questions that we have, but they're not necessarily happy with the religious answers.
For sure. And to be fair, those early sociologists all predicted the end of religion, right? All predicted that it was either going to go away or should go away, either sort of objectively or normatively, that religion, those answers were based in non-science. They were based in non-fact, and therefore the rise of science, the rise of industrialization would do away with them because we'd see past myth. And yet it persists. And so while the global statistics on atheism or agnosticism even have risen, they are larger than they ever been. They are still in the vast minority of the world's in industrialized, the UK, Western Europe, as we know, is highly secularized, which is to say this church and the state are not the same thing, but the levels of non-belief are perhaps at the highest, especially in the Nordic countries, as we know. But Europe is the anomaly globally. So while atheism, people, it feels in some cases like a progress, like we can take from religion the morality, certain moralities, I suppose, the coming together. We can do all those things without religion, and that's frequently the pushback you hear, is that say, well, I can have morals and I can have a community and I don't need God telling me that that's good things. Absolutely. But at the same time, that doesn't seem to be as convincing enough an answer that everyone's jumped on board. So there's something, to your point, maybe there's something confounding about the fact that religion persists.
Yeah.
Right? Because we are a rational, scientific world. And it's funny because I've raised this question before, that we in America in particular, as you know, are highly religious, right? Statistically, we go to church a lot, we believe a lot. And yet in our public schools, we teach science as the answer. It's a vast disconnect, which I find fascinating. And I'm not advocating it should be one or the other, but it's fascinating that this division exists, that we hold our faith so strongly, and yet we publicly educate that God is not the answer. So one of those two things, I don't know that you could call it competing, but it's fascinating that we hold them both so strongly in our system and our communities, that public school matters, and yet faith matters too. And they do, to your point, give differing answers to those questions. So I don't know that I have a good reason for why. I don't know if you're asking why hasn't atheism done better in the global race. I don't know. It's a good question because I myself know that science answers most of our stuff. I understand that we don't need, my wife and I are not churchgoers. We're not religious people. And we have a good community. We raise our kids to be moral and just and kind, and God doesn't figure into that equation. And so I know that that's possible and it's a thing. And I don't know, I don't think there's evidence to say that atheist communities or at least questioning communities are somehow developing or demonstrating poor social outcomes, right? Which is to say, I don't think the science shows that atheism is bad for people. I think folks on the other side of the aisle might want to present arguments to say that, they're going to end up bad somehow. But so to your point, I don't know. I don't know that there's a good answer for why atheism I think atheism is probably too broad a term, but various forms of non-belief or non-religious community haven't been more powerful or more successful in their growth. Because I hesitate to say, well, it's because we still suffer and those questions still get answered, because I think it's too simplistic. But it's a good question. So I'm struggling to work through it, as you can see. So it's a great question.
I was just thinking from a UK point of view, whether religion is still there, but it's a lot more selective. And what I mean by that is I'm not sure it's necessarily at the forefront of everyone's mind all the time.
Sure.
However, I noticed in the UK that a lot of people that don't really go to church, couldn't really care about religion, when they get married, they go to church.
For sure.
At the time of recording, tomorrow is the Queen's funeral. I've seen more religion over the last week than I've seen at any point for the last 10 years in the British media. So I'm just wondering whether people just sort of pull on religion a little bit more selectively rather than it being dominant in their lives.
Oh, absolutely. And it has that in many instances has everything to do with identity, right? That the Church of England is the Church of England, and she was the head of the Church of England. We see various religious communities take this on. Jewish communities, in America and in the UK, vary from highly religious to highly non-religious, but the highly non-religious will still show up for the high holy days. They'll still go and hang out with their families for meals. There are community generative activities that we do, and this goes back to Durkheim and solidarity, right? How do you find your tribe? How do you find your people? Well, I may not feel faith. May not feel God in my daily life, but it certainly feels nice to be around my family. And this is what my family's always done. And I can leave it there and then go do the rest of what I normally do. So yes, I think this is a great example, and people are going to be writing about this, that the uptick on religious participation in and around the Queen's death, because in part she was the head of the Church of England. And much like, I'd imagine, I don't know, you could tell me how it works in England, but for instance, in Scandinavian countries, people are born into the state church, even though Denmark, Sweden, Norway have just about the least amount of religious participation in the world. The cross is still on their flag, right? And you were born into the Lutheran church, even though you may never go to church again. And so there's still an identity process happening that religion and history and culture are tied together, so that if you come from this place, you are tied to this thing, even if you never do it again. So I think what you're seeing is just the Englishness of the English church having its moment.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, it'd be great, if somebody started doing some survey work and doing the pre and post funeral activities, I think it'd prove your point out pretty clearly. But yeah, I think it's about solidarity, that moment of solidarity when we live in a fractured world. UK politics are no more healthy than American politics in this way, and us and them and right and left and all that crap. For that moment, the folks can come around, and a lot of folks, not everybody, I'm sure you're well aware of the pushback about the Queen and the monarchy.
Yes.
but people can come together and rally around that thing. It's when the Three Lions go play in the World Cup, everyone's an England fan all of a sudden, right? I think there's obviously lots written about sports and religion being sharing many things, and that's one of those things. It's a moment of solidarity, and it's that moment of coalescing around an identity where you can feel part of something that maybe 90 days out of 100 you don't feel.
Yeah. Because in that same respect, a lot of people in Britain refer to themselves as culturally something. So they might say, I'm not religious, but I'm culturally Jewish, I'm culturally Muslim. Is that a similar pattern elsewhere, I'm guessing?
Yes, absolutely. And it's, what's interesting in that is it has a lot to do with immigration and generation. So you see patterns of this in the UK, you see patterns of this in the US, where that first generation of immigrant being non-Christian comes to the U.S., may not speak a lot of English, works really hard, frequently maintains a very strong religious identity. Their next generation of kid, they work very hard to send to school, and that kid rejects lots of identity, very secular, learns English perfectly, doesn't want anything to do with that, their parents being those foreigners. And then their kids, that third generation, show up and say, wait a minute, but I'm Pakistani, right? I am from Bangladesh. This is my family. This is my culture. I'm okay being Muslim. I'm okay learning language again. And so you see patterns of that happen quite a bit in our two similar societies that include a lot of immigration and a lot of multi-generational ethnic change, that people will reject it and take it back. I mean, there's a lot of taking back. The work being done, there's quite a bit of it, of taking back religious and cultural identities of second and third generation immigrant families is really fascinating. Because the Pakistani and South Asian communities in the UK have faced as much or more discrimination than we have here. And so there's some really fascinating work on that certain generations will grab onto it and say, this is me, but then you'll see that their parents are the ones that pushed it away. So it is interesting to see that again, and then on the other side of that, Christian folks in the UK, white, specifically white Christian folks, do the same thing. It doesn't take immigration, but it'll be those moments of coming back to an identity, coming back to history, coming back to family, even if for the most part that's not their identity. It is an interesting phenomenon of process.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
I wonder, Jonas, if people are happy to water down their faith, so, a lot of people in the UK don't go to church, for example,
right.
They don't think about God every day and it's not a key part of their life, but letting go of it completely, 100% letting go. Is there a fear there to let that go? Is it a fear of losing culture and identity, or is it just holding on to that what if?
Yeah, I think, we're sociologists, so we can't we do big chunks of people in big numbers. And so my cop-out answer is everyone's different. So I think all of those apply, and I think all of those happen. I think you're absolutely right in describing it that way. I think there are variations on that theme from extreme to minor, but there are it's hard to say. It's hard to say if you picked up anyone off the street and tried to quiz them on their faith, whatever it may be, and conclude with, okay, so what do you really think is going to happen? And does that drive your motivation to identify that way? I would guess that more people cling on seems pejorative, doesn't it? Hold on to a faith identity on whatever scale for the connectivity to other people, for the community, for family, more than the existential questions. That would be my guess. You will always find people who are worried about the end times and what becomes of us. But my guess is more people are concerned about having community in, we tend to think of modern societies in just sort of big cities, and you imagine that poor person walking to the city for the first time and just being overwhelmed, like, I am connected to nothing and I have no social anchor, and what am I going to do when the city's going to eat me alive? And of course, that's what early sociology was really trying to grapple with. And religion and religious communities, religious identity still provide those holes, right? So I work at a university, 20,000 undergrads, and kids are, for the first time in many instances, free to do whatever it is they want. And many, of course, do. That includes leaving their religious faith or not being attentive to it. But there are lots of religious communities here for students that they immediately go and find, right? That they want to be part of, that they want to anchor themselves in. And so religion, again, I'm falling back on a functionalist definition, which is probably is poor on my part. But the idea that religion still provides community, even if you ask a 20-year-old who's partying on the weekends, do you worry about the end of your life and where you're going to go? I don't think the answer is yes. I think it's, when I'm faced with whether or not I go party or go to the library, at least I have these 20 other people that I know aren't going to be partying that I can rely on to give me support. That's one example of why people hold on. But I think to your point, yes, it's more about, I think it's less about the existential and more about the community is why people would be hanging on in face of atheist arguments for why it doesn't matter.
Yeah. It's coming back to that comfort word again, isn't it?
I think so. We as creatures prefer comfort, right? We like warmth. We like shelter. We like being safe. There is, again, I try not to be too biological about it, but at the end of the day, and then you start going down a Marxist perspective of like, well, we need food and shelter before we need anything else. And so the idea of being comforted and being safe, that is on somewhere, 100,000 years ago in our biology, is hardwired into us, and religion and community, sort of defined by religion, perhaps, is a strong pull for us, for sure.
Yeah, it just reminds me of Ricky Gervais, who himself is, very much defines himself as an atheist. Said, if a small child lost his mother in a car accident and the child said to you, "Will I see my mum again?" It's much easier to say, yes, you will one day, than probably not.
Sure. Absolutely.
And I can understand that. That I can understand where that comes from.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We are sensitive to and receptive of things that feel good, for sure. Now I've somehow gotten more Marx into my brain than I ever thought I would 20 years ago. But when he talked about religion being the opiate of the masses, people frequently mistake that for saying, religion's a drug that gets you addicted, and sort of a mind washing and control. And it's not that at all. What he meant was that people in their current conditions suffer, that the working conditions are horrible, that you as a proletariat are not feeling good about your life, and religion relieves you of some of that. That's what he meant, right? It's not about being addicted and taking your life over. Rather, it's a salve. It's something to make you feel better because your life is awful. So, again, that poor child. Yeah, the answer to that kid isn't no, she's gone. Sorry. It's let me try to offer something that feels better.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that through. Even if are we lying to that child? Because a lot of people who'd say yes, of course you will. You'll see your mum again one day in heaven. Probably don't believe that.
Oh, I think 100% people wouldn't believe that. Yeah. I shouldn't say 100%, but just to be, devil's advocate isn't a great space to take up. But we don't actually know if you'll see your mother again. Right? Growing up, as I moved away from having any sort of faith, it always occurred to me that, the Catholic Church, for all of its many, many sins, of which we're very well aware, they were not anti-science as much as religion tends to be, right? They got on board with, well, eventually I should say, right? They got on board with a lot of stuff. And it always occurred to me that, religion had answers or science had answers, and science kept answering and go further up the food chain of development, of history, of science, of what science could answer. And then it stops. At some point, science doesn't have all the answers. And that seemed always to me like a good space religion could fit in. And religion felt comfortable being there, saying, yeah, you can have your telescopes and you can see the sun, and that's great. But at some point, you don't know the answers, and faith isn't a bad place to fit in there. And so You say that child, are you going to see your mom again? And to you and I, rationally, the answer is no, because the scientific method says we can't know that. But also, good science recognizes what it doesn't know. And so, in the realm of a billion possibilities, is it possible in a way that we can't know that maybe there is a heaven and a God? My brain says yes, that's possible. Is it probable based on everything we know? No. But it's hubris to suggest that we know everything there is to know.
Absolutely.
So that I just sort of bird walked around a way of getting away with answering that without like you're lying to the kid, I guess. Having children myself, I have to think through some of the ways in which I answer those kind of questions.
And I just going back to what you said right at the start as well, you're interested in the connection between state and religion as well. Yes. Based on what you just said, even what we consider the most secular societies, Scandinavian countries and so on, I'm assuming there's no country that has no connection to religion and state. Is that right? No detachment.
Not that I've identified for sure. Again, because religion is passed down, because even in the most secularized countries, because they have been secular. Now, again, secularization is one of my favorite topics because it means a lot of things. It has meant a lot of things. It's not always understood properly, or at least accurately. But in the case of, let's say, Sweden or Denmark or another very what we call secularized countries, what you're talking about is that the state no longer identifies with a particular religious tradition. You are not bound to be part of it. Although, again, per my previous example, it seems like they are almost in those countries where you're born into the church. But religion is therefore passed down through family. So again, back to the family connection. You were Catholic because your parents or one of your parents is Catholic. I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic because my mother's Catholic. So the state, and look at China, which I can't speak on with any authority, but it's pretty clear that they in the Soviet Union at one point were making hard pushes against having any public understanding or recognition or definition of religion. But people of faith still exist because it's passed down through family. So the state can only do so much insofar as stopping people from having faith. And on the flip side, in the U.S., where we have these what we like to think of very clearly delineated lines between the state and religion, we see that that's actually coming together quite a bit more than it has in the last, say, 50 years. So, no, I don't think the state can't stop religion, can't stop faith. And again, religion and faith are two different things, of course. But no, the state has not shown, any state has not shown itself particularly strong at being able to stop it wholly. Although, to be fair, I don't know what the hell goes on in North Korea. Right. I don't think anyone does. But I would imagine it would be my logical brain says, my sociological imagination says, I can't imagine that's a country full of faithless people.
So my next question on that is, do you see a situation where any country will move towards a religious-less country?
No.
Where you can't see it. No.
No, I don't think so. I mean, again, in America, can you imagine somebody running for president saying, I don't believe in God? It would never happen. Even if it's a lie, it will never happen. I don't see in our lifetimes, maybe multiple lifetimes, that happening. Now, again, sociology, big numbers versus individuals, I'm picking on the Swedes and Danes and Norwegians too much, sorry, but could Norway be 99.9% faithless? If you could have some survey instrument to do it, sure. At which point you say collectively, yeah, that religion has gone out of Norway. But my guess is if you went door to door and started knocking, you'd find somebody. So, the question I think you're asking maybe is, could you get to a point of a faithless society, and then what would it mean, right? How would it interact with its neighbors? What would it generate versus saying, does it really matter if there's 1 or 100 or 1,000? Because then it's not faithless. I don't think you're asking that sort of minutia. I think you're asking what would it matter if a nation went faithless? And that's a good question. I don't think it would matter much in terms of international politics. I don't think we tend to the U.S. leads with its Bible sometimes, but I think most of the rest of the world doesn't interact with other of its neighbors from a position of faith or religious identity. So I don't know that it would matter in that way so much. It may matter in terms of who's willing to move there, right? What kind of immigration you can bring in if people feel unsafe or unwelcome because of the religious tradition, and therefore then you have an economic problem, right? How many of our societies have benefited for 500 years from, I'll use it loosely, immigration, which is sort of euphemistic for what we've done in the US and the UK more generally, but places like Norway, Sweden that have benefited from the last 30, 40 years of immigration of frequently brown Muslims, right? So if Muslims were like, I'm not going to go there anymore, what kind of brain blockade would they be having, right? What kind of labor would they be missing out on? So in that way, it would matter. But in terms of how society operates, I can see it not having a huge impact, because currently most nation states, most states don't operate from a faith-based policy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I'm just wondering whether it could be stripped out of policy, but not out of human choice and behavior. I'm not sure if that question makes sense.
Oh, no, it does. It does. And again, we've tried to do it in the U.S., right? That is our First Amendment. It is a freedom of religion and a freedom from compulsion, right? So the state stood up and said, "Listen, the English were dumb for hundreds of years, killing each other, Protestants and Catholics. Let's not do that anymore. Let's skip that part. You are free to do whatever you want, provided you don't step on the rights of other people." And also, the state isn't going to force you. There's going to be no test for religion. You're not going to be forced to do it. Go do your stuff. And the U.S. for a long time has sort of tried to run that way, which is hands off. And we are, by plenty of measures, among the most religious group of people on the planet. So the nominal separation of church and state has not, in any real way, fostered a cultural removal of religion. Quite the opposite in some ways.
Perhaps I could make this the last question for you, Jonas. Yeah. If just flipping that thought, if we allow free expression, choice of religion, more multicultural societies such as we've seen in the UK, the argument always is that leads to more conflict, and trying to sure. Accommodate for multi-faith societies.
Sure, and you've seen in the UK, and in fact, like I said, I studied Canada because they invented the idea of multiculturalism as a policy. And I find it fascinating. So our neighbor to the north, who looks like us, sounds like us, is much smaller, but is our closest analog, closer even than the UK in so many ways. And they established in the 70s with Pierre Trudeau an idea of of multiculturalism, and it really comes from, or with some history, but it comes from that 18th century split between the Anglos and the Francophones in Quebec and Ontario, basically, right? And then the Canadian government built itself around the idea that you could have these two distinct people, actually use the word different peoples, in one society. And it develops over time because of immigration to have to include people who are not white Christians, right? And so you have Ukrainians and all sorts of Ukrainian Orthodox, and you have South Asians, and you have Native peoples aren't even part of the equation, unfortunately. But you have all sorts of other groups showing up, and eventually the Trudeau government realizes, well, we can't just be because they wanted to be bicultural. That didn't really work. So they had to become multicultural. And if you can think of a place less conflict-y than Canada, I'd like to know it, right? So they figured it out. And this is, I'm glad you asked, because this is where my research was going, is it hasn't meant much in terms of religious identity. That is, the government names religion as one of the identities that is protected by a multiculturalism policy, a federal policy, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have any teeth other than there may be some money set aside for celebrations, and federal and provincial employees need to be trained properly, right, to be culturally sensitive. It's mostly around culture and language and gender eventually. It's very rarely leveraged for religious identity, but what it means is the government is now on the hook when people make religion a discriminatory identity. So now to get back to, so what it means is that the government in different from the US has inserted itself into religious identity in a way that is not as hands-off as we are in the US. However, it hasn't manifested to mean much, but also there hasn't been any conflict. There hasn't been any real, now there are incidents of conflict. There are people who do really terrible things, for sure. We have them here, we have them there, you have them, they exist. But there haven't been large-scale conflicts between religious groups. I say that with a caveat that Quebec in the last 15 years has started to get quite a bit more aggressively secular, a la the French, to ban hijabs, to ban minarets, to do things that are particularly targeted towards Muslims, and that is problematic because they've taken secularization. It's my favorite part of the fact that secularization and it comes out of liberal societies, right? It's liberalness to the point of being illiberal, where you are telling people they can't express their religious identity because somehow it's offensive to other people. It's bizarre, but that goes on in Quebec. They borrow a lot of that from the French, who have, a long-standing, interesting and conflictual relationship with their Muslim population, having everything to do, of course, with colonialism. But I don't know that there's been, and maybe you can correct me, I don't know if there have been examples of liberal democracies wherein religious identity, let's say in the last 50 years, wherein religious identity has been the basis for conflict. I think maybe the only one you could maybe point to, and I will do this very hesitantly and very delicately, might be Israel, but I think there's arguments to be made about how liberal democracy that truly is. I'll leave that there. Lebanon is an interesting example, right? That's a place where the government was set up to be co-run by Christians and Muslims, and obviously the conflicts there are sort of more geopolitical, I would say, than they are in fact about religious identity. Again, because religion is mapped onto other identities as well, culture, race, ethnicity, and so it's not so much that the Christians and Muslims are in conflict because they're trying to convert each other, but you hear it more talked about Christians and Arabs, which is terrible because a lot of those Christians are Arab. So it's more geopolitical than it is religious. So to answer your question, I don't know that there are examples where we can look to and say, you know what, they got too open with their religion and now look what's happening. I think the one thing that I got concerned about when looking at multiculturalism is that, especially in Canada, that there's been several referenda in Canada for Quebec to leave, to be independent because of its specific cultural linguistic heritage. And so my thought was, geez, if the government allows Quebec to leave, and there are other provinces who feel like they want to split off too because they're too different from what goes on in Toronto and Ottawa, and the Western states, by the way, I don't know if you're familiar with any of this stuff. The stuff on the West Coast also looks east and says, I don't know what those people are doing. We're our own thing. And you have a territory given to the native folks as being separate and different, that there's sort of and I wrote about this, 20 years ago. It's been, God, that there's been a precedent of division and separation based on the fact that you can do this, that you're separate, you can be different, you're separate, you can be different. I was concerned that what if the million plus or maybe 2 million now Muslims in Canada, which by the way are hyper diverse and they come from all over the world with all different versions and interpretations of Islam, so it's not a monolithic group by any means. But what if a particular group of Muslims said, you know what, we want our own territory? There's on some level precedent for this to happen in a system of liberal recognition and acceptance. And that was sort of my worst case scenario. It's like, what if? I don't see that would ever happen. The majority of Muslims in Western societies, the UK, Canada, and the US, are still first generation immigrants. Yeah. And so people don't come to Canada, don't come to the US because they want to remake Pakistan. Right? They don't come to Brixton to remake Bangladesh, right? I mean, they do. You have these communities. The southeast side of London is vibrant and colorful and amazing, and they make little communities. But again, generationally, that second and third generation, then they go branch out, then they go do other stuff.
Yeah.
Right? They frequently are leaving places they want to leave because the opportunities are better, economics are better, safety is better. And so the idea that people are going to want to come to a new place and remake it in the image from which they left and then break away and be separate, you can see in sort of a dystopian future where that's possible. I just don't think there's any evidence that it's probable or that it's something we need to worry too much about.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you. There's so much more I'd like to unpack. I wonder if you wouldn't mind coming back on as a guest again in the future.
Anytime.
Great, thank you. And I always ask people if you want to give out any details, Jonas. Do you, if people want to add you on Twitter or read more of your work at all?
You can find me on Twitter. It's at where am I at? JH1791. No one has ever asked me what the 1791 is, but I'm on Twitter a lot. Twitter has been a rather amazing resource. I know people don't like it, but I found, more than probably half my following, the people I follow are sociologists, and it's a great way to hear from and about people who are different from you. And so I'm lucky enough to be able to follow, especially in the US, lots of women of color, lots of people whose life experiences are different from mine. And so, when they publish or they talk about stuff, it's stuff I don't have direct access to in my daily life. So it's nice to be able to connect to those people. And so that's sort of where you can find me around. If you Google me, you'll find me somewhere.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jonas. I really do appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Matthew. And I would love to chat anytime.
Yeah, please do. Thank you very much.
Take care.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.